researcher interested in ethnohistories and the anthropology of indigeneity. He is also a contributing writer in various publications, including Kawaiʻola, Oha. Adam, welcome. And was it indigeneity or indigenuity, I think?
Indigeneity. And my last name is Manalo Camp.
Manalo Camp, yes.
Yep.
Well, welcome. Thank you for bringing us together, and thank you to AHAverim.
Oh, okay. Well, aloha. Welcome to the last in a series of 3 webinars dedicated to exploring the intersectionality of Native Hawaiian and Jewish histories, topics, and a sense of place. This webinar is co-sponsored by AHAverim and the Matsunaga Institute for Peace and Conflict Resolution. AHAverim is a research project funded by the Jews of Color Initiative. On our team are Imani Altemis Williams, Rebecca Maria Goldschmidt, and myself, Adam Kiave Manalo Camp. Representing the Matsunaga Institute is our moderator for these webinars, Dr. Maya Soetoro. Mahalo everyone for your participation and to our viewers. I will now turn it over to our moderator to introduce our wonderful guest for today.
Mahalo, Adam, very grateful for your work. And before I introduce our special guest today, I'd like to invite Dr. David Koffman to offer a land acknowledgement.
Great, thank you. Well, I'm zooming in from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, from the traditional territories of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabeg, the Huron-Wendat, and the current treaty holders, the Mississauga, the New Credit First Nation. These are the signatories on the Toronto Purchase Treaty, which is from 1813, if I'm not mistaken. So this is land around the Great Lakes region, which is subject to the very old intranational agreement among members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, sometimes called the Iroquois Confederacy, which is called the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which basically obliges all who live in these lands to care and share to care for them and to share them. I'm happy to be with you all tonight.
Thank you so much. And we here in Hawaii also offer up a land acknowledgement, acknowledging Hawaii as an indigenous space whose original people, the Kānaka Maoli, have shaped generations of knowledge systems and interactions so that Hawaii is a sustainable space. And we are able to enjoy her gifts today. And for this, we are truly grateful. I would like to give a little bit of a reading of the bios of David Aiona Chang, who is Kānaka Maoli historian of indigenous people, colonialism, borders, and migration in Hawaii and North America, focusing especially on the histories of Native American and Native Hawaiian people. He's a distinguished McKnight Professor of the Departments of History, American Indian Studies, and American Studies, as well as the chair of the Committee of the Press from the University of Minnesota. He is the author of The World and All Things Upon It, Native Hawaiian Geographies of Exploration and the Color of the Land. Dr. David Koffman is the J. Richard Schiff Chair for the Study of Canadian Jewry at York University, an associate professor in the Department of History. He is editor-in-chief of the journal Canadian Jewish Studies, author of The Jews, Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America, and the editor of and contributor to No Better Home, Jews, Canada, and a Sense of Belonging. David is the acting director of the Israel and Golda Koshitsky Center for Jewish Studies and the program coordinator for the Jewish Studies undergraduate program at York University. Mahalo for being here and welcome to you both.
Thank you.
So to both of you, and perhaps I'd love to hear from David Aiona, first, perhaps, since we have yet to hear from you. From your perspective, what is the concept of melting pot? What does that mean or imply, and how do you feel about that concept?
Mahalo. Thank you so much for inviting me to be with you today. Just briefly, I am joining you from the lands of the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians in El Dorado County, California, not only from their lands, but from their tribal administration building, where I am today, working with the Shingle Springs tribe here in California. And it is a great privilege to be talking to you today about this topic, which matters so much to me. So from my perspective, what does the concept of the melting pot mean or imply? Well, I'm a historian, so I have to approach it, first of all, historically, and then I can explain to you my objection to how the term might work for us as Indigenous people and in regards to Indigenous people. So the melting pot implies that everything melts into one thing, that individual distinctions, national distinctions, cultural distinctions disappear, that they meld and create a new whole. And it has early origins in United States history. People were using the word melting pot going to just after the American Revolution. But it got popular in the beginning of the 20th century in 1908 when a man named Israel Zangwill wrote a play. He was a Jewish-British playwright of Lithuanian parentage, and he wrote this play, The Melting Pot, which was celebrating what he thought was what America was and should be, which is this melting of all these differences into a new person, the American. And that's the paradigm of what it meant. But very soon, another very famous writer named Horace Kallen, another Jewish writer, he was an American writer, he was of Polish parentage or Polish Jewish immigrant ancestry, he rejected the term. And he wrote a book an essay called Democracy and the Melting Pot. And he said, no, it's not a melting pot because we're not going to lose our distinctiveness. Instead, we're going to enter a world of pluralism where we can democratically celebrate our differences. The one thing about Zangwill and Kallen, for all their differences, they were both celebrating America. And there was an aspiration to what America meant to them. And it was to enter into that and be accepted into that either by melting or maintaining some difference in a kind of a pluralistic salad bowl. But you ask what it means to me is that's the problem for me with the melting pot image or even the pluralistic image that's brought to it. Because what happens is it's the aspiration to being American, the celebration of the romance of America, which is a real problem for Kānaka. It's a real problem for Indigenous people across Turtle Island. And because what we're looking at here is not U.S. as an aspiration, but the U.S. as an occupation or an occupying power, right? And so this is why when I look at it, I understand it historically, but I also understand it as a problem with which I and all of us need to struggle.
Mahalo. David, would you like to answer that question?
Yeah, I mean, I had thought a little bit about the theme, the term the rubric we're talking about today, and I had very similar set of thoughts to Dr. Chang, including talking about both Israel Zangwill and Horace Kallen, who were two, as he says, sort of early 20th century thinkers, a British and an American, who were struggling and trying to think about what it meant to be a part of the American project. This idea of the melting pot is like a crucible. The metaphor is like of a pressure cooker that breaks down less individual identities and national, ethnic, even religious differences. That was a word that was sort of designed to think about how immigrant populations would fuse together to produce something called a nation of immigrants, as the phrase goes. And as David also said, as Dr. Chang also said, you know, the term gains in great popularity precisely during the time of the great mass migration waves from Europe, from Eastern Europe, as well as Western Europe, from the 1880s, like right up until immigration restriction laws come into being in the early 1920s. For Jews that were thinking about this question, the idea of a melting pot was actually quite a bit of a threat, even though Zangwill and many other Jews praised it, and many Jews decided that it was sort of worth the modern bargain in America, as they thought it was worth the deal, the modern bargain in Western European states in the 18th and 19th century to basically give up their Jewishness in order to participate in and take the bounty and the access and the privilege that they saw as being part of being citizens in liberal democracies. So for Jewish history, this was like a kind of bargain, a Faustian bargain, but a bargain that has echoed its way through several centuries of modern Jewish life in America, no less than in Europe. Horace Cowan's idea of his pluralism, like Dr. Chang mentioned, I don't see it as a melting pot idea. He articulated this. I think his favorite metaphor was the symphony, with the idea, romantic, probably wrong idea, aspirational idea, no doubt, that different peoples that inhabited America would act as each player playing a different instrument that together would make some kind of beautiful music. He didn't speak about indigenous people at all. So this is a major fundamental challenge to the Cowan idea and to the other pluralist ideas of people writing from the early part of the 20th century in America. Maybe I just add, just out of interest, that the notion never really took hold in Canada, where I'm zooming in from today. Canadians have long prided themselves on the idea that the country is a mosaic rather than a melting pot. The idea that different immigrant or settler populations would keep their distinctiveness and still be able to be part of a nation that doesn't define itself in sort of racial or peoplehood terms. And this is, there's a long history of accommodation between the two dominant settler populations in Canada, the French Catholic and the English Protestant. So the myth goes, there's something about the binational nature of this country's founding, that made it easier for minorities to avoid charges of dual allegiance. You couldn't be both what you were, your kind of organic identities and part of the Canadian project. And this becomes enshrined in federal policy in Canada with official multiculturalism in the 1970s. So state-sponsored and funded pluralism, which never happens in the United States. And indeed, even our current prime minister, likes to talk about the country as a post-national country, as a country that's unified by people of difference. I would also echo Professor Chang's important insight that indigenous voices challenge all of this, of course, because all of these terms and ideas about pluralism, whether it's a melty kind or a pluralistic mosaic kind, are all voices of immigrant or settler populations.
Thank you very much. I wonder if you can, I realize we have two Dr. Davids here, so I'll just use your last names, Dr. Chang, Dr. Koffman, but I wonder if you would, Dr. Koffman, just add a little bit more on some of the additional themes that emerged as you were researching and writing your book, The Jews, Indian, Colonialism, Pluralism, and Belonging in America. I mean, you've touched on obviously some of the relevant themes, but can you share with us a little more about the understanding and the ideas that emerged during the crafting of that book?
Well, when I set out to do research for this book, I really had no idea what I would find. It was not a project that started with a kind of intervention. It was really something that grew out of a desire to look at the sources. I had started off thinking about American anthropologists, like the first generation of pluralist, relativist American anthropologists under Franz Boas and Edward Sapir, who were both two Jewish immigrants. And they produced a lot of students who helped pioneer and professionalize the discipline, who were also first generation or second generation American Jews. And these were scholars, social scientists who, men and women actually, who wrote about indigenous people and lived with different peoples and nations and thought about their languages and their religions and their cosmologies and their family, family systems of reckoning kinship, and spoke to their non-indigenous, a non-indigenous public about culture. And they were basically these anti-racist specialists who were trying to argue against the idea that people were defined by their biology or their character or their blood, this sort of racial idea that accounted for the differences between human civilizations. And they wanted to account for it in a different way that was mutable, changeable, culturally determined, not hierarchical. So I was just interested in these anthropologists and thinking about these anthropologists from a Jewish history perspective of how they were trying to intervene in a conversation about race in America, using indigenous subjects as their mouthpiece. And interestingly, they never wrote about their Jewishness in their scholarly careers. I think they thought that to do so would undermine their own, academic credentials or intellectual, bona fides. So they wrote about indigenous people with whom they, lived for most of their lives. At the same time, they also carried on very extensive kind of off the record relationships with Jewish communities and did all kinds of advocacy work for both Jews and Native Americans. Anyway, I was interested in these people to start. And an incident happened. I won't bore you with the details, but I just started to think a little bit more broadly of when and where had indigenous people and Jews encountered each other at all, and what did those encounters look like? And I just started casting a very, very wide net and tried to find as many sources about indigenous people in Jewish archives and find as many references to Jews in various sorts of indigenous collections, and just assembled this mass of primary source material out of which the book came. So some of the specific areas that I hadn't intended on discovering but did were about small businesses as a site of exchange of ideas and culture. The really important kind of theme about the land and its resources and the broad contest for control and ownership over those land and resources. This, of course, is set in a very asymmetrical context of a state with a military that obviously supported and favored the rights of migrants over natives. I thought a lot about religious difference and about sort of American Jews' ideas of themselves as a minority, of being a people that were once slaves in Egypt, of being part of the legacy of the left, basically, and bringing Eastern European anti-imperial ideas to the table in America, thinking about how they'd, gotten beat up so badly as kind of Europe's colonial whipping boy inside Europe, and were, had fraught feelings about this, even as they participated in the colonial process in America. So I thought, trying to think a little bit about indigeneity and its flip side, like the flip side of the same coin of the idea of exile, which for Jews is a kind of animating idea about belonging and where you are. And there's the Jews who struggled with what it means to be home, or as a people that had been land alienated, but still very much a people, bound by language, by stories, by text, by history, by tradition, and by a sense of being part of a peoplehood, despite being scattered from one another and detached from any language base. So the book basically explores some of these themes and tries to trace some change over time between basically the middle of the 19th century to the middle of the 20th. Big scope.
Hello, very interesting. And Dr. Chang, in your book, The World and All Things Upon It, Native Hawaiian Geographies of Exploration, you wrote about the Kānaka Maoli building relationships with other indigenous peoples as they became global explorers. What were some of the relationships and understandings, the sharing of mana'o that you discovered in the research and writing of that book?
Mahalo for that question. It was a fascinating process for me to trace this. And I mean, when I talk about explorers and exploring, one of the things that's important to me is to understand all of us in the modern world, in the modern period. When we use the word explorer or exploring, generally the term was very Eurocentric, and it celebrated a certain set of privileged, often state-sponsored men from Europe who went and quote unquote explored, even worse, and discovered faraway lands and reported them to other people. And I mean, the objections to the term exploration there are easy to make, and they've been made many times, right? That this is a colonial project, that it's an imperial project, that presumes that these people didn't know where they were, and so on and so forth. And that's but at the same time, I wanted to really emphasize that in the rapid changes of that ran from the beginning of the 1500s into the middle of the 1800s, all of humanity were explorers, okay? The world was changing, and the world was to be understood. And so in a much more innocent sense, people needed to explore and to learn. And sometimes they did this physically through going someplace and seeing a land they'd never seen, seeing people they'd never seen before, and trying to come to an understanding of what they were. And sometimes others were not able or did not choose to physically travel, and so forth. Therefore, their explorations were often intellectual, often textual, and happened for people who could read via text, for other people through oral transmission of knowledge. So a lot of what I talk about in that exploration is people, especially men, but not exclusively, who did travel far away from Hawaii, beginning in the end of the 18th century and stretching forward from there. And many of them came to North America for a number of reasons. One of the primary reasons that they started to travel around was as laborers on American and European-owned ships. So Kānaka were very often, recruited into that labor. And so therefore, as European and American capitalism, commercial capitalism expanded, Kānaka were physically present at that process. And they were also intellectually present at that process. They were not the drivers of it, but they were part of it. Similarly, as that quickly turned into and was related to a fur trade, one often sponsored by the American Fur Company and then the Hudson's Bay Company, where I imagine Dr. Koffman might shop sometimes at the Hudson's Bay Company, which is the largest department store chain still in Canada. Kānaka were important employees, clerks, and often, in going into the interior of what we'd call the Pacific Northwest in Canada today. And then another final kind of process that brought many Kānaka out towards the world were gold rushes. The gold rush in California, where I currently am located, and other gold rushes as well, including up the Fraser River in British Columbia. And so as Kānaka did this shipboard labor, as they did gold labor, as they did fur trade labor, they encountered a lot of Native American people. And as they did that, they had to come to terms and had to come to an understanding of who these people were, what they were like, how they were like or unlike Kānaka. And so what this created, because Kānaka very quickly embraced written knowledge after it was created in the islands in the 1820s, it created a massive amount of records. And some of those are records where Kānaka wrote and reported on what they saw, who they interacted with. And so we get texts from sailors who wrote about other sailors, because many Native American men were also working on the ships that were plying the oceans. and working in whaling ships. But one of the most important areas of the relationships that were built were on the coasts around fur trade and around gold rush sites. And in those areas, many Kānaka, who were these laboring populations were mostly men, created families with Native American populations, with Native American women. And so those relationships created long-term relationships for the individuals, but also lineages that still matter today, lineages which have a sense of themselves very often as both Kānaka and Native American, privileging the Native American because this is, or First Nations Canadian, because this is the nation to which their identification is strong and must be, and quite appropriately, but still with a consciousness and sometimes a pride and an enduring connection to Hawaii. So that's one area. And where I am right now in Shingle Springs, this is one of those nations, right, that has a very strong connection to Hawaii while being a federally recognized and proudly an American Indian nation. But that's those who traveled. But this process of learning about the world and thinking about one's place in it in relationship to indigenous people was also an intellectual project that happened via text, via reading, and also via writing. Because, and it's an important one for us today as Kānaka, and also it's important to many Native American people. To make a story short, the missionaries who went to Hawaii were trying to teach Hawaiians their place, beginning in the 1820s and the 1830s. And when I say their place, I mean their place in the world and their place in a hierarchy. And so when they put them in their place, one of the things they tried to teach them is how they were somewhat like other people that we would call indigenous today, including Native Americans, and how they should not be like those people, how they should aspire to not be like other people that we would call indigenous today. So there's very pejorative messages put into the Hawaiian language by Congregationalist missionaries from New England that tell a lot of stories about Native American people that are negative lessons. This is what they are like, and this is what you must not be like. And those were sometimes taken in by Kānaka because they were the only lessons they were given. But over the course of the 19th century, as Kānaka were able to travel overseas, and as those stories started to filter back to Hawaii, much more complex and sometimes much more positive notions of Oiwi America, of Native Americans, started to come into circulation in Hawaii. And this gained even more prominence late in the century, when American colonialism was turning into formal American imperialism. And when you see the overthrow of the Hawaiian kingdom in 1893 by Americans, and then the occupation/annexation of Hawaii in 1898 by the United States, by that time, the metaphor of Native Hawaiians being like Native Americans had begun to become resonant and powerful for Native Hawaiian people, for Kānaka people. And so, and that's important to me because these days we have a global consciousness of what indigeneity means. We think of as Kānaka and we pay attention to the political, cultural, and other struggles of indigenous people globally. And probably because we have a shared colonial power, the United States, there's a particular emphasis on Native North America. So part of what I want to say is these experiences in the 18th and the 19th century are an early genealogy of the contemporary political idea of the global indigenous and of the political urgency that many of us feel as Kānaka to understand our struggles as part of and not separate from those of other Native people, including those in North America.
Mahalo. So I want to just first acknowledge that we have people from all over. We have New Jersey and Florida and Massachusetts, Kona, Hawaii, Mamuwikma Olone lands in San Jose, but also from the Mokua district of Ewa. So thank you all for being here. For those of you who are in the audience here or watching on Facebook Live, I invite you once again to add your questions. And we will, in about 15 minutes, begin asking your questions. But next, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Koffman. You've been quoted as saying that Jewish immigration history must be recast in the context into which all American ethnic immigration properly fits, but within which it is rarely cast, namely settler colonial expansion. Would you please expand on that idea and speak a bit more about how that impacts the way American Jews and Jews from Canada see themselves? Has and does that impact Jewish relationships with Native Americans, Oiwi American, or Kānaka even? Would you speak to that, please?
It's a great set of questions. Maybe I'll start with the Canada-US difference. I mean, I think from with a wide enough aperture, there's not a really significant difference between Canada and the US, and it's probably better to first emphasize their similarities. As it is, I think, actually similar to essentially all the 19th, early 20th century kind of Jewish immigration stories of Jewish movement from Central Eastern European, the margins of the Russian Empire primarily, to Argentina, to Australia, to Mexico, South Africa, as well as to Canada, the United States. Basically, like, I think that immigration and the settler colonial are basically denote the same thing, even though these two words, immigration, colonialism, have a very dramatically different connotations. So two connotations, but one denotation. These were people that were caught up for different reasons, for various reasons and motivations, in the remarkable transformation of the continent that took place in this era, particularly this long century of mass migration, which reshaped the conditions and the relationships for so many people all around the world. So I think that the book, and what I've been speaking about since I published the book, is just basically trying to make the case that for Jewish studies audience, for Jewish historians, even for Jewish members of the Jewish community itself, that by studying Jewish indigenous interactions, we get to see some of the same story that we've heard and reproduced for a very long time about Jewish struggles and Jewish successes in an entirely new light. So the story, by paying attention to Jewish interactions with Native people, like David Chang was describing, both in actual face-to-face terms, in the fur trade and in the gold rushes, and in the peddler routes of itinerant Jewish traders, and in all sorts of other face-to-face interactions, and in the kind of conceptual realm of imagined encounters, takes place through texts and through thinking through imagined encounters, that this sheds a certain kind of light on the story that we already do know. So it doesn't actually undo the story and the really important elements of Jewish history about the need that Jews had to flee Europe and Russia. It doesn't undermine or undo the tribulations of poverty and discrimination and anti-Semitism that immigrant Jews faced in Canada and the United States and Argentina and Mexico and so forth. And it doesn't undermine the truly remarkable communal effort that Jewish immigrant groups provided themselves to thrive and grow Jewish life, grow Jewish religious expression, Jewish culture, Jewish empowerment. But it's one that really complicates the story. So I think of it like, adding a big green spotlight to something that had only been lit by a single red one prior, and it just changes the way the whole picture looks. It's one that makes the story much more difficult, and it has very serious implications, not just for U.S. Jewish history, but for Jewish modernity and how historians, how the public thinks about Jewish modernity more broadly. Because if you look from this wide enough angle, you see Jews moving among these massive streams of people, not with full agency and a great set of choices, but they behave in ways and are, rewarded for their place in a hierarchy that had been established without them, but certainly benefited them relative to indigenous people and certainly to Black people, maybe less so than other settler populations. But if we see this whole drama and this whole story taking seriously the viewpoint of those who are already here, in the lots of different places that here is, in the Pacific Northwest and in the American Southwest or in California or in the plains or everywhere else, there's a lot of different, very specific heres that we see this, we see the entire story of modern Jewish emancipation and recreation of Jewish life, the reimagining of Jewish life as a European thing to a quote unquote New World project in completely different light. So maybe I'll just add something about the merits of, or maybe the potential value of thinking about this kind of project, what I like to think of as disaggregating settler populations. So in my kind of close, careful read of the Jewish experience, the Jewish encounter with indigeneity in North America, we have some very specific Jewish valences, specific meanings that Jews made of this encounter, and some specific differences that we see with the Jewish encounter as compared with other people, including Hawaiians, but also including, Portuguese and French, French encounters. They have to do with Jews' sort of alienation from and lack of interest in land ownership. Have to do with Jews' much stronger resistance to celebrating sexual conquest, but also in practical terms, having less sex and building fewer new families and hybrid groups with Native peoples. There was certainly sex, but the community doesn't praise it and build on it in the way that it happens with lots of other people, which incidentally was partly for assimilative purposes and as a part of a conquering thing as well as a hybrid thing and could be looked at in different ways. But the idea of disaggregating the different settler groups into the categories and sort of having readers, contemporary readers, people in our world, think about their own histories and their own primary identity commitments as native relations, I think disaggregates this kind of group of people called settlers. It's only, very progressives who see themselves and identify themselves as settlers. They see themselves as Mormons or as Chinese Canadians or as Japanese Americans or as, as Episcopalians or as, French Catholics or whatever. And so I think that if all these different groups actually did deep dives on their own immigrant/colonial settler stories as they made indigenous connections, then we might be able to do better work in the large reconciliation process that so many people are committed to and I think is really important. Just to give one, brief emphasis on this, the Canadian, there was a Canadian Truth and Reconciliation process, and they dropped the major report with a series of 93 recommendations, and to the number, they're all aimed at state activities. And I think that civic bodies, that community bodies, that religious organizations can play a big role in this story too, because we as citizens see ourselves as deeply connected to histories, to languages, to religious cultures. And if we bring these parts of ourselves to the urgency and the drama and the thoughtfulness that's required for reconciliation, then we may go in ways, but I think it'll be a real boon to the state-sponsored process or the state-pushed process that also has to change.
Thank you. Thank you for pointing out the sort of multifaceted and nuanced aspects of the role of settler colonial expansion. Dr. Chang, could the idea of melting pot be seen through an indigenous lens as being a sort of polite term for settler colonialism or assimilation? And how does the narrative of the melting pot also impact Kānaka Maoli and the diaspora?
Wow, two really great questions. And I think that, in my opinion, from the point of view of Kānaka Maoli and from indigenous people more broadly, the idea of the melting pot is just irredeemable. And we should not try to redeem it. Because if putting an emphasis first on Kānaka in Hawaii, like Hawaii, like the United States, like Canada, is a settler colonial space, right? And it is a settler colonial space like the rest of the United States, but it has its own particular history that is very specific to it, even allowing for all the regional differences within North America. Hawaii's experience is very particular, and for Kānaka and Hawaii, there's just no way that this idea of the melting pot can fit. The closest model that actually often a term that was used very much is the creation of the local, right? So when we talk about Hawaii local, as kind of as for those of you who are on the continent don't know the term, local often refers to kind of the post-plantation culture that emerged with roots in Hawaiian, in Japanese, Chinese, Filipino, Portuguese, other kind of post-plantation culture that out of which came the Creole that we refer to as pidgin, and a kind of a mixed cuisine that most people understand these days as Hawaiian food, though it's not indigenous Hawaiian food, right? So that's a kind of an iteration that's a specific something like the melting pot. But what that does is that ultimately that idea of local erases the more fundamental notion of indigenous, right? So it claims a locality instead of kind of looking at the real question of power and of the power that eliminated the autonomy of the indigenous population of Hawaii. And in Hawaii, as in the rest of the other settler colonies, people came from around the world, Asia, the Pacific, North America, the Caribbean, elsewhere, and they came, some with wealth and power, many came without. But however they came, many of these people became settlers. And I really want to give Dr. Koffman a lot of credit for the work that he's doing. It's really very important work to think about replacing the word immigrant with the word settler, but then doing it in a way that's nuanced and thoughtful. Because the thing about the word settler is it's not a moral condemnation. It's a definition of what something is in relationship to a structure. And we need to talk about our settler in that way. Because otherwise it just seems like a slur. It's like, oh, you called me a settler. It's like, no, this is a settler colony and you're not indigenous, therefore you're a settler, which is not the end of the conversation. It's the beginning of the conversation. And that conversation is, what do we do now? What is the pono thing to do? How do we make a pono society, which may include decolonization? And then we have to talk about what decolonization is. So the whole problem with the melting pot word is it forecloses all that conversation. And that's precisely the conversation that we need to open up. And that I'm glad, it seems to me that Dr. Koffman is very invested in that question, because the scholars, I'm glad to be in this conversation because this is not work that is merely historical. It has ethical claims on us, and we want to embrace those ethical claims. And we want to talk about them without claiming to be the moral authority, right? Because that's not what it is. So to get back to the question, sorry, I wandered there, but to get back to the question, it's an irredeemable term. For Kānaka in Hawaii, And I really would just take us back to the words of Hanani K. Trask in 1993 on the centenary of the overthrow of the kingdom. Because if the melting pot is aspirational Americanism, would remember what she said. She said, we are not Americans. We have never been Americans. We will die as Americans. We are not Americans. We will never be Americans. So that's the refusal of the romance of the melting pot right there. And it speaks back in very clear terms to kind of the violence that the melting pot glosses over. So that's what I would have to say about that.
Thank you, Dr. Chang. So I want to kind of close the asking of my questions actually by handing it over to you. Do you have any questions for one another?
Oh, I do. I feel like I could talk to Dr. Chang for hours about this. I've actually embarrassed to say that I haven't read your work, but hearing you talk, there's so many interesting parallels and really curious places where they kind of butt up against each other. And I just like the way you describe this. It resonates very well with the way I've been thinking about these things. And I've also, I started my project. It was an intellectual exercise. And I didn't actually have a background in thinking about colonial history at all, about settler colonialism. It wasn't even, I never took a course where we'd specifically focus on this. I hadn't even thought about it. And I think only out of looking through the sources and coming to the only conclusion that I came to, did I see the, political ramifications of it. And since I published the book and started, speaking, I've found a credible live interest from Jewish communities across North America in engaging and thinking and struggling. I get asked, so like routinely to, comment or help synagogues think about if and how and when to build a land claim, land acknowledgement into religious services, think about how they're doing their work here. I mean, it's very much a live conversation, probably more alive than it is in Canada, the United States, because of the nature of the civic conversation here. So I don't know. I have a million things that I actually would ask, but there's one specific one that I really want to take your pulse on as a historian, as a contemporary observer, which is about the kind of question that hovers over Jewish modernity and the C word colonialism, which is about Israel. So there are basically those who characterize Israel as a colonial state and see it as, the act of European colonial migrants that move, that settle on new lands, that displace people, that build a state in somewhere where, it ought not be, and therefore it's settler colonial like other ones. There are, however, those who see the state and characterize it as very much an anti-colonial process or a post-colonial process, which is to say a persecuted minority within Europe that revives its ancient language, that returns itself to political power, sovereignty on its ancestral homeland, that acts as a kind of model for those indigenous peoples that aspire to political sovereignty. Now, I know there are people in Canada and continental United States, indigenous intellectuals and leaders who have in the past and continue to date who really deeply identify with the Jewish state as a kind of model for resurgence and language revitalization and cultural striving. And of course, we know that there are those indigenous leaders and intellectuals, numerically probably larger, who speak about the Jewish state as imperial or settler colonial, or sometimes even a British or European or even an American kind of puppet state that's best characterized as a colonial oppressor. So I'm curious if you, Dr. Chang, have any sense about how Hawaiians see it, if there's a history of engagement with the idea of Israel, the reality of Israel, if you might have any specific insights that we might gain by sort of seeing Israel from the vantage point of the middle of the Pacific, or if this is something that comes up or not at all. I'm just curious to get your take.
I'll give it a shot, and then I'll back off, and then I have some other comments about other things I'd love to talk to you about with. I would say that in the contemporary moment, you'd be hard-pressed to find many Native Hawaiians who would think of the building of the state of Israel as being a process akin to one for the building of a Hawaiian sovereignty, no matter how they understand Hawaiian sovereignty, right? And so you're not going to find sympathy for the creation or certainly the contemporary administration and government of the state of Israel widespread among Kānaka. Much as you wouldn't in many, in any indigenous population, you know, across North America, that's not likely to be found. Now let's think a little bit historically. Now, I'm not speaking about the state of Israel, but like, the people Israel, right? So if you want to talk about the people Israel and kind of the biblical notion of the people Israel, or just even today, it's kind of the global notion of Jewry, if you will, right? Mm-hmm. That's one that has had resonance, and for some people still do. And this is true partly via religious engagements with the Hebrew Bible. And the most recent session in this series of which you're a part is part of that was literally about King Kalakaua's Torah, which was a gift to him from a Jewish merchant in Honolulu, and with which he was deeply engaged intellectually. And I would argue this was not a small matter for him to think about different people, their textual traditions, their sacred traditions of peoplehood, okay? Another area where you see this is those people who were told by Europeans and took seriously the notion that Kānaka were a lost tribe of Israel, right? And that sense of genetic relationship to the ancient Israelite people, not Israel today, but the ancient Israelite people was very powerful in the growth of certain religious movements, including, as Hokulani Aikau at the University of Victoria argues, had a lot to do with the growth of Mormonism and the Mormon story in the Book of Mormon of Lehi and all that story coming up. And then finally, kind of the sense of, so that older sense endures still, but it is older and it's enduring, and it's about the Israelites and not about Israel. I would say. Now, I'm sure that there are exceptions to that case, right? But that would be by and large what you would find in Hawaii today. I don't know about what you'd find in the moment of the creation of the state of Israel. That'd be really interesting to go back and see what happened at that time. But if I can, at that point, one of the resonances I see between you, and I agree, I could talk to you for hours about this. Actually, let's do that. Let's talk.
Let's do that.
But not right now. But one of the things that I think is really important for us as Kānaka in diaspora, in thinking about the word settler and as indigenous people and our relation to settler colonialism, is a move that I think is there's some it rhymes in some ways with what you're talking about with Jewish people and thinking about their relationship to settler colonialism. Because the fact is, one can be Kānaka in North America and just be a plain old settler. It's not hard. You can just ignore the fact of where you are. You can pay no attention to your responsibilities to the ʻāina, the responsibilities, the oiwi of that land. You can not pay no attention to the fact that it was a common colonizer that created a situation. You can fail to pay attention to your relative status of in a hierarchy, because much like you, I think it's very important to not think only in terms of binaries, but to think about hierarchies and one's relative position. And just as Jewish people may have been on the losing side of anti-Semitism, they were not on the losing side of all of the racial hierarchy, and below them there were people.
Correct.
This is true also for Kānaka in the past and Kānaka in the present. There are people who also face who face very difficult circumstances to which certain Kānaka are exempt, okay? And so therefore, one could look at this, and it could be, and this could happen also, that the claim to ancestral persecution or the persecution of people in a homeland and could be inappropriately used by some Kānaka to not do what I think we must do. And that is to say, we are responsible to and engaged with the native people of the lands upon whom we live. And they are not our lands, and we may be Kānaka, we may be indigenous in Hawaii, but I am in Ohio, Montana, Ontario. And so therefore I have to think about the native people of this place and act with that. I am most proud and most excited to find stories that inspire me and show me how to live in a Pono way in the situation where I find myself, but also challenge me to think about, can the situation I live in be Pono? Or must I really think about decolonization in a very literal sense? Mm-hmm. So we can't escape our responsibility because of true stories about why we ended up where we are. And I would say this is true of Kānaka as it is of Jews across North America.
Mm-hmm. This is fascinating. I love what you're saying. And I think it's very important and challenging to, insist that one can be, both indigenous and settler. There's obviously a long history of indigenous migrations around the country, around the continent, around Turtle Island, lots of other places. I don't have a lot of familiarity. It feels like a kind of new idea to hear indigenous thinking about diaspora, indigenous diaspora, even though there's a lot of indigenous displacement, certainly. That's I think very, very deep and very, very, very important. Right? It's very interesting.
Thank you to you both. I'd like to now at the top of the hour ask a couple of questions that were placed in the chat. Aaron says, I'm a music student in Massachusetts studying global music for the classroom so that we can diversify the music our children are learning and hearing in schools. How would you say, in your own personal experience, the concept of the melting pot has affected the music of the cultures we are discussing?
Well, it's a fascinating question. There's a recent resurgence, a recent very strong contemporary interest in Jewish music, Jewish musicologists and performance, and in training and just in sort of consumption from Jewish audiences here in North America. And it's very hybrid. It's very focused on intra-Jewish diversity and is a sort of product of, melting pot is certainly it has the wrong resonances. But there is, something that happens in late 20th century Jewish life in North America with the existence of Jews from so many different backgrounds, with their hybrid food and music, like foodways and musical traditions that were born out of long interactions with people from in the host countries from which they came. So Jews from Yemen and Jews from Iraq and Jews from North Africa and Jews from Bulgaria and Jews from Poland had incredibly rich connections with people with whom they lived for 1,000 years. These were not kind of indigenous forms from the get-go. They had always been hybrid forms in which you had Jewish cultures making particularly influence in music, less so in food, less so in fine arts, but in music with people who, the non-Jews in their host cultures, but them all arriving together in North America, particularly in the last 50 years, there's been a kind of swell of enthusiasm of thinking about how these different forms of already hybridized Jewish music might further, inflect one another and create new sounds, which is completely celebrated. But at these performances, you'll often hear, a band leader, often very, very learned about these musical traditions, present, a real palette of musical options. So I don't know. It's a very interesting question. It seems to me there's a lot more room and excitement and enthusiasm for musical hybridity. Maybe this is because of the people's convictions that music is a force that can bring people together, and the sense that something is, inherently has a specific sound, is immutably something, is maybe a little more flexible. Musicians also like to play music with one another and bring their own repertoire and influences to one another. So it's a pretty interesting challenge to the to this more historical, version of the American melting pot idea that both Dr. Chang and I beat up on. But we're in a different sphere maybe with music. I don't know. It's a very good question.
I guess if I could jump in on that, I think that what Dr. Koffman just did, and I think was important, is he said, no, not melting pot, but I'm going to talk about hybridity. And he talked about Jewish hybridity and the entry of different kind of musics into kind of a Jewish canon that or Jewish musical world that maybe contemporary North American Jews are now embracing. You know what I mean? And I think that in terms of in the Hawaiian world, we could see this very strongly in terms of music. We could see it in terms of food, and we could see it in terms of our lineages. In all of these, so in terms of music, for example, we see from the taking of the ukulele from Madeiran Portuguese settlers all the way up to contemporary well, not contemporary because I'm old, so what do I know about contemporary music? But Sudden Rush taking on in Jamaican music or reggae, and then mixing in hip hop, to the brilliant Kekuhi Kanahele, who can do jazz just as well as she can do an iomele, right? Or to food, Hawaiian food, which includes what we now call a Hawaiian food, can include foods taken in dishes adapted from around the world, to our own families, okay, which are apparent in our surnames, right? And in our genealogies, these are very often mixed. But one thing about them that is very important is it's not, for Kānaka, it is the adoption of these outside things does not entail the loss of self. You don't stop, it doesn't stop being Hawaiian music. A Sudden Rush decides to do Jawaiian with some rap on top of it, right? And it does not stop being a proper luau because you're eating chicken long rice, which comes from a South Chinese dish. And you don't stop being Hawaiian because you have ancestors who are not Hawaiian, or because you don't speak Hawaiian, right? So I would say that part of this is, instead of a melting pot, there's the assertion that we have the right to learn and to take from the whole world and to be part of the world and not stop being Hawaiian. And that's something I think is so positive for us as Kānaka, that sense that we can embrace it all, and that doesn't undo being Hawaiian. But that there's a core commitment to being Kānaka.
Makes a lot of sense to me.
Mm-hmm.
So there's another question here. Why do you think the sufferings of Jewish Americans, Dr. Koffman, and Kānaka Maoli, Dr. Chang, have faded so much into the melting pot, when in American culture, we have recently popularized investigating the sufferings of certain other cultural minorities in our modern day culture?
I don't think that we are disappearing, personally. With due respect to the person who asked the question, I think that it is important for us to be talking about Black Lives Matter. I think it is important for us to talk about the colonization of North America. It's essential for us to talk about these things in American history. I think we also have to talk about what's going on and the occupation of Hawaii and the genocide, that the cultural genocide, linguicide that we've faced. So I want us to be more visible, but I don't know that we're fading. Or I don't personally feel that we are fading in the face of attention to other social necessary struggles.
Yeah, if I follow the question right, I think maybe the questioner was asking about why do Jews and Kānaka get less attention than other popular discourse around suffering. If that's the right, okay, yes, that's the right question. I mean, I think speak for about Jews. I think it's a complicated question. It has partly to do with the misappropriation, the misunderstanding of Jews as white and the kind of racial construction of whiteness. Jews have all kinds of different, phenotypes and, share sort of biological presentation with Black folks and with Asian folks and with North African folks and Arabs, and like we're a kind of intraracial people that's not biologically oriented. But I think in the popular imagination, Jews kind of all look like me. They're Ashkenazi, descendants of Eastern Europeans. And I think that's partly one of the things that has complicated Americans' capacity to think about anti-Semitism in relation to anti-Black racism and in relation to anti-Indigenous racism. I think another part of it has to do with the specifics of anti-Jewish ideas, which are often about the Jews' supposed power, his, outsized capacity to manipulate or control, and it's a discourse about fear of the Jews' power, a teeny tiny minority that supposedly has a capacity through imagined wealth and imagined power to have conspiratorial control. And so it's a little bit hard for general populations to think about a powerful group as a powerless group. These, of course, are complete fabrications. It's precisely the nature of anti-Semitism to target Jews in this way, which is just different from a lot of other forms of racism and how we talk about them in the modern world. And I think the final reason is because it's a little harder to talk about sort of anti-religious religious dimensions of group hate in this discourse that seems to be primarily or founded on ideas of race. And since in the United States, there's a kind of conviction that, that religion is a kind of separate and private matter, that there's a difficulty for people to understand the tight connection, the kind of cultural and ethnic and communal nature of religion. It's not something that you believe. It's not about faith. It's about a community's practice. Jews are Jews, at least most Jews. Some Jews are Jews by virtue of their religious connections, their ties to things that kind of look like it, basically that Americans don't have a good idea of religion. They think of it as separate somehow from race or ethnicity or something like that. And it's not quite how it works for Jews. So it takes a little bit of a rethink for the conversation to be able to find good ways of incorporating Jewish persecution. And we certainly know that it's on the rise globally in the United States, for certain, plays a really fundamental role. Anti-Jewishness plays a very fundamental role in the far right of your country, the United States, but also in many other, it's resurgent in many other places in the world. And it's in order to capture it, to understand it, to kind of be able to include Jews in this conversation, there has to be some more, some wider thinking about peoplehood and the nature of group suffering.
Thank you for that multidimensional answer. We have a flash round now because we only have 3 minutes left. Although we started a couple of minutes late, so maybe we can go for 5 more minutes. But very briefly, the 2 remaining questions. The first one is, have Hawaiian Jewish interactions generally been friendly, hostile, neutral? And has it been different for secular Jews v. Orthodox Jews?
I can't really say. I think that question's probably for me and Dr. Koffman more than anything. I don't have enough knowledge to say. I do know that there's been mutual fascination to a certain extent sometimes in Hawaii. I do know that there's also been, I know that sometimes that general anti-Semitic beliefs can filter into society, and that some Kānaka have have eaten of that poisonous dish. I know, and then you're going to find that happens, right? And I don't know this from personal experience, but I have no doubt that general settler condescension and beliefs about Kānaka have been shared by Jews in Hawaii. I don't have personal knowledge of that, but I can't imagine that it's not to a certain extent true, given the general circulation of these ideas.
Yeah, as a flash answer, I would say my hunch is probably the same, but I likewise have no experience and no research under my belt about this. So I think it's actually a fascinating question and probably one that's worth some exploration. I think especially if we sort of add this kind of Israel piece historically, like there's a great article or a couple articles or a book or something in there that I think it's really interesting, worthwhile research from a historical or a more contemporary sociological perspective. So it's a great question. Well, unfortunately, I can't answer it.
You've handed the audience a mission then. So the final question is, I'm a public health student in New York studying refugee health and health equity. How has the melting pot influenced access to healthcare? The melting pot is a concept, of course, especially primary/preventative care in both settler and indigenous perspectives.
Not the melting pot per se, but the inattention to the difference of health background, health outcome, health equity that goes with, if you fall for the melting pot myth, just basically the general inattention to the inequality within the medical system is a real problem. Kānaka have terrible outcomes as a population, but if we don't disaggregate, we're not going to see those things. And the terrible reality of COVID and what it meant to Kānaka is great evidence of that.
Yeah, I think that's a fantastic answer. I'm satisfied with that. There's a very interesting, long, curious history of Jews in the American medical establishment. So the Jewish, health outcomes are quite good. And I think you see, I wouldn't say that the Jews are representative of the general settler population, but there's a kind of, this kind of theme of disaggregation, of taking different sorts of communities and taking their histories, including their relationships with the medical care system seriously. You'll end up with different courses, different trajectories, different problems, and different conclusions. So that's not something that I've spent a lot of time doing actual research on, but it's quite interesting to me as well.
Well, thank you both for this very interesting conversation, which is just a beginning, just like your long hours of conversation that I anticipate you'll have in the future. Dr. David, I'd like to say that it's been a privilege to be part of this series. I'd like to thank Jose Barzola from the Matsunaga Institute for supporting, and I'd really like to thank the team of AHAverim, Imani Altimus Williams, Adam Keave Manalo Camp, and Rebecca Maria Goldschmidt. Thank you very much for your work in our beloved community and in the world. And I hope that there will be ample opportunity for shared endeavor and connection in the future.
Mahalo, toda raba.
Thank you very much.
Mahalo.